Good afternoon. Welcome to this presentation on Kenya and, well, you can say it either way, Tanzania or Tanzania, depending on where you're from and your preference. I'll call it Tanzania because that's what I'm most used to. My name is still Don, and I'm glad to be with you to give another one of our talks. And oh yeah, Susie is still my wife.
Thank you.
The virtual motor vessel PVE has just sailed through the Suez Canal and emerged relatively unscathed into the Red Sea and then into the Indian Ocean. And now we travel south in the Indian Ocean along the east coast of the African continent. Here we'll delve into the natural history of the area and look at some of its landscape, its plants, and its animals. Then we'll explore the modern day history of Tanzania and Kenya, and we'll include the famous story of Stanley and Livingstone. After that, we'll look at the culture of some of the African people. The development of a new continent started millions of years ago. The African plate began to pull apart from the Arabian plate. And there was an enormous earthquake explosion kind of an event that caused the entire eastern rim to give way, forming a gorge. That was the beginning of the Great Rift Valley. As it continues to widen and deepen over the next geologic centuries, it will eventually fill with water from the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And Africa will soon, I guess you could say in geologic years, not in our lifetime, give birth to another new continent. Geologists have given it the working name of the Somalia continent. Mount Kilimanjaro is the African continent's highest freestanding mountain. It stands over 19,000 feet above sea level. Now, it's a stratovolcano, which means that it was created over a lot of different volcanic eruptions, has very steep sides, and for the time being anyway, like all volcanoes that are not spewing stuff, it's considered dormant. It sits in the country of Tanzania, and it's on the east side of Lake Victoria. This mountain started to form 3 million years ago, a couple days ago. Volcanic eruptions and the rise and fall of huge areas of land led to new ecosystems. The existing plants and animals were able to evolve into new species. Spices grew abundantly in Tanzania, especially on the islands around Zanzibar. Those islands produce cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and black pepper. They're sometimes referred to locally as the Spice Islands, but as you all know, the Portuguese considered Indonesia and the stuff way out further to be the Spice Islands. The use of spice is nearly as old as human history. As far back as 2600 BCE, the Egyptians fed spices to their laborers that were building the Great Pyramids. Why? They wanted to give them strength. I didn't know that worked, or I'd have been eating spices a lot. Anyway, well before the 6th century BCE, Confucius promoted the use of ginger, mostly for stomach conditions. Europe imported spices before Rome was founded. The use of spices as seasoning in food was a status symbol. They were presented as gifts of state and were bequeathed in wills together with people's other heirlooms. Rents and debts could be paid with spices rather than gold. How's this for an idea? Maybe PVE will accept spices for our monthly dues. Doesn't that sound like a good idea? We'll take that one to the board. Clove was once the world's most valuable and expensive commodity. It sparked the Dutch colonization of Indonesia, as well as the Portuguese trying to get out there. And for the people of Zanzibar, spices and other useful plants are a vital part of their everyday life. Spices are grown in local kitchen gardens, and those include pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, cardamom, and nutmeg. They provide innumerable cures for pretty much everyday ailments, and they also yield the dyes and the cosmetic products that are needed to celebrate weddings and festivals and other kinds of rituals. Actually, cloves are a dry flower bud. that's bright red when it's ready for harvest. They have a numbing effect on the tissues in the mouth. Clove originated in Indonesia and was introduced into Tanzania in the first half of the 19th century, so pretty close to 1800. Tanzania was at one time the world's leading clove producer, but clove sales plummeted by 80% in the last 40 years. It was crippled by a fast-moving global market, international competition, and a hangover from Tanzania's failed experiment when they tried to do a lot of socialistic things. That's when the government controlled the clove prices and the exports. Zanzibar, which is actually a part of Tanzania, now ranks a distant third. Oops, went too fast. And Indonesia has regained its prominence, and they produce about 75% of the world's clove. A nutmeg resembles a little apricot, and it comes from the fruit of an aromatic evergreen tree. The tree has dark green leaves and a small yellow flower. It bears a fruit when it's about 7 years old and will continue for decades thereafter. Now, nutmeg is usually grated or ground for flavor in many dishes. It's also believed to cure digestive, liver, and skin problems. Inside the fruit is a walnut-sized seed covering that's covered with this red-orange stripes or strips. The strips are mace, and the hard seed that's inside of that is the nutmeg. Now, nutmeg and mace have very similar qualities. Nutmeg is slightly sweeter, while mace has a more delicate flavor. Mace is usually preferred for lighter dishes because of its bright orange, saffron-like hue that changes the color of the dish. I always carry a little mace in my purse for protection. Nutmeg is believed to be mildly hallucinogenic, and it also is believed to have some aphrodisiac qualities. It is said that a woman's eyes get big when she's feeling romantic. This spice is used by females during the Muslim holidays as a disinhibitor, much as we in the West use alcohol. Small amounts grated into porridge are used at weddings and other big gatherings where alcohol might be frowned upon. Jackfruit is also grown in Eastern Africa. Now, why is jackfruit showing up so much on our tables here when we have the vegetarian dishes at PVE? Well, it has the texture of shredded chicken when it's used as a meat substitute in plant-based meals. It's very high in protein, potassium, and vitamin B. And with about 95 calories to a half a cup, it isn't quite as highly carbohydrate or caloric as other staples such as rice or potatoes. Jackfruit is the largest tree fruit in the world, capable of reaching 100 pounds. It grows on low branches and really just up against the trunks of the trees. And having them grow on the trunks and really low near to the ground is a really good thing because it reduces the odds that you'll have one fall on your head. One of the more interesting plants to grow in the region is achiote. The scent of this fruit is described as slightly peppery with a hint of nutmeg. Dried seeds are used as a culinary spice. The Aztecs, way over here in the Americas, used these seeds to intensify the flavor and color of their chocolate drinks. Now we're talking. The spice is sold in several forms. It can be whole, ground, or as a paste, or even in cakes, or infused into cooking oil or lard. Cooking with achiote oil gives color to paella, meats, soups, and stews. After soaking the fruit in water, the pulp is formed into cakes that can be used to make dyes. It's used in sunscreen and insect repellent. Achiote can also be used to color rice and custard, baked goods, processed food, snack foods, breakfast cereals, smoked fish, and more. But that's not all. It's sometimes called the lipstick tree. I wanted to bring home a couple of cases of this stuff because I thought it'd save me a ton of money to keep Susie from buying so much lipstick. Research on early human development was led by Mary and Louis Leakey. That's the legendary Kenyan family of paleontologists that had Scottish roots. Now, paleontology is the scientific study of the evolution of life. It includes the study of fossils to determine organisms' evolution and their interactions with each other and their environments. These observations have been documented not by the Leakeys, but by all kinds of people back as far as 2,500 years ago. The Leakeys worked at various sites throughout Kenya and Tanzania beginning in about 1935. They encountered all kinds of obstacles that included harsh weather conditions and kind of severe places to work in the bush, as well as sparse funding. One of Leakey's most significant findings was a 1.75 million year old Australopithecus skull. It was unearthed in 1959 in the Tanzanian Olduvai Gorge. In 1948, Mary found the first perfectly preserved skull and facial bones of a hominid. That one was about 16 million years old. This tiny little ape was found near Lake Victoria, and it was thought to be the missing link. It was a tree-dwelling monkey that boasted a bigger brain than any of its contemporaries. Perhaps the most sensational discovery of all the Leakey's finds were Laetoli footprints that are preserved in volcanic ash. They were found in 1976 in Kenya. Dated to about 3.7 million years ago, they were the oldest known evidence of hominin bipedalism at that time. Analysis of the footprints showed clear evidence that bipedalism preceded enlarged brains. And you can kind of see the feet, the footprint mold plus the guy's regular foot. So they were tiny little people. In 1984, Leakey's son Richard found the most impressive fossil in his, or perhaps anybody else's, career. This skeleton is believed to be the missing link in the chain of species, ancestors of apes and humans to modern man. It was a nearly complete skeleton of an 11-year-old Homo erectus boy. He was nicknamed the Turkana boy. He was found in Kenya's Turkana Lake region. Homo erectus appears to have been the first hominid to migrate out of Africa. These very early people moved to other parts of the world as early as 1.6 million years ago. Beginning about the same time, maybe a million or so years ago, East Africa was the scene of some really great human migrations. The first outsiders to move down into East Africa came from the north and settled in what is now called Kenya. For at least 20,000 years, Tanzania has been home to humans. The first permanent modern residents were the ancestors of the Bantu people. They began arriving, maybe 1,000 years ago. They lived in small villages and did not merge with any of the other groups. Because they lacked central organization, these people were easily dominated by outsiders. The countless tribes in Africa break down into many sub-tribes, so we're just going to talk about a couple of the major ones. The Kikuyu are a Bantu people. They're the largest ethnic group in Kenya, and there are about 6 million Kikuyu, or just under 20% of that country's population. The Kikuyu have many beliefs. One is that the first humans were created by God. They have the strongest vital force because they got it directly from God. Their God is not forming any more people. So an individual's dead ancestors are their link to God. The life force of a dead ancestor comes back to life through the birth of a new child. Later, the east coast of Africa was frequented by traders from the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab people also had prosperous trade at the time with India and China. Now, in Africa, they coexisted with the Bantu people who came from the west several hundred years earlier. The joint settlements of Bantu people and the Arabs led to the creation of what is known today as the Swahili culture. The Bantu people still make up about 3/4 of Kenya's population. The last ethnic group to arrive in Kenya came around 2,000 years ago from southern Sudan. We'll look at the Maasai tribe near the end of today's presentation for reasons that will be obvious when we get there. That's kind of an inferred warning. Vasco da Gama's visit in 1498 marked the beginning of European influence in Kenya and Tanzania. He explored along the east coast of Africa, but it was slow and there were many setbacks. Arabs controlled the area and encounters with the natives were often dangerous and difficult. As a result, the Portuguese had a hostile relationship with the natives and the Arabs. Near modern-day Kenya, the expedition turned to piracy. Da Gama's fleet was in dire need of provisions, so the Portuguese looted Arab merchant ships. One legend has it that Vasco's battle cry was, "For Christ and spices!" Unfortunately, in one attempt to gain an advantage, da Gama had impersonated a Muslim. The local people kind of figured it out and they became suspicious and he was forced to flee. As he departed the harbor, da Gama fired cannons into the city in retaliation. As they say, that was a dumb move, Vasco, because he had left behind Portuguese traders and sailors to try to establish a sailing post, and the Sultan slaughtered them. The first Portuguese efforts were aimed at establishing trading posts rather than creating permanent settlements. They bartered goods, gold, and gems. Portugal sent criminals to build plantations and to colonize the islands. They successfully produced wine, wheat, and sugar. And they built a large fort in Stonestown in Zanzibar. Eventually, Portugal's occupation led to construction of a monumental fort that still stands today. It's known as Fort Jesus, and it was the first European-style fort designed to resist cannon fire that was constructed outside of Europe. The area later became part of the Portuguese Empire when tribute was demanded and received from an Arab sultan in exchange for peace. When the British colonized Kenya, they used Fort Jesus as a prison. And several years ago, Fort Jesus was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Let's take a closer look at Sultan Said and his family. The Sultan built the Marahube Palace that's shown here. That was for his wife and about 200 concubines. Oh yeah, it looked a lot better when it was built. The Sultan actually lived in a separate palace in Zanzibar town. I don't blame him. Would any of you guys really want to live with 101 women? The historic center of Zanzibar is Stone Town. It's a World Heritage Site. In 1862, Said bin Sultan moved his capital from Muscat in Oman to Stone Town in Zanzibar. During his 14-year reign, Said consolidated his power around a huge slave trade industry. As many as 50,000 slaves passed through Zanzibar's docks every year. It was the Swahili Coast main harbor for the slave trade with the Middle East. When he died, the Sultan's will divided his territories into two separate principalities. One son became the Sultan of Oman, and the other the first Sultan of Zanzibar. Now, the brothers weren't real happy with that breakdown, and they quarreled about the will, but they fell under the jurisdiction of outsiders, and eventually the will was upheld by the Viceroy of Great Britain and the Governor General of India. Many slaves were captured by an Arab called Tipu Tib. The natives called him that because of the sound that his many guns made. Tip, tip, tip. Anyway, I'm not a real good impersonator of gunfire. He was a notorious trader and ivory merchant. He led huge expeditions, some as big as maybe 40,000 individuals into the African interior. There, the local chiefs would sell him slaves for next to nothing. Generally, those were people that the individual tribes had captured from their enemies. Tib also bought ivory from Central Africans who sold it also to him for a very low price. Then he used the slaves to caravan the ivory back to Zanzibar. Once there, he sold both the slaves and the ivory in the markets, and he got huge profits. In time, Tibb became one of the wealthiest men in Zanzibar. He owned multiple plantations and had perhaps 10,000 slaves. Tipu Tibb had an interesting background. His mother was a Muscat Arab born into the ruling class. His father and paternal grandfather were coastal Swahili. He met and helped several famous Western explorers on the African continent, including Henry Morton Stanley. I bet you didn't see that coming, did you? John Rowlands was born in 1841 in Wales. His parents were unmarried, and even his birth certificate describes him as a bastard. The stigma of illegitimacy weighed heavily upon him for all of his life. He was sent to a workhouse for the poor, where overcrowding conditions and lack of supervision resulted in frequent abuse by older boys. At 18, Rowlands sailed to the United States as a stowaway, searching for a new life. He landed in New Orleans and became friendly with a wealthy merchant named Henry Hope Stanley. Rowlands saw Mr. Stanley just sitting on his porch in his chair having a nice afternoon and asked if he had any jobs. In a very short time, they became fast friends, and Rowlands, the young Rowlands, took the name of Stanley. The newly named Henry Morton Stanley took on a local accent and denied being a foreigner. Young Stanley participated in, albeit reluctantly, in the American Civil War. He first joined the Confederate Army and then the Union Army. From there, he joined the Union Navy in search of, greater adventures. And he may have been the only individual to serve in the Confederate Army, the Union Army, and the Union Navy. Following the Civil War, Henry Morton Stanley embarked on a career as a journalist. He organized an expedition to the Ottoman Empire, over in Istanbul. It ended catastrophically when Stanley was imprisoned, but he was pretty glib, and eventually he talked his way out of jail and even received compensation for his damaged expedition equipment. I wonder how you do that. Soon, Stanley was retained by James Gordon Bennett, the founder of the New York Herald. And then in 1869, Henry Stanley was instructed by Bennett's son to find the Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone. Now I'll digress for a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Livingstone. David Livingstone was a 19th century Victorian British citizen who had near mythic status. He was a Protestant missionary, came from a working class background, and was a rags to riches story. He was a scientific investigator and an explorer, an imperial reformer, an anti-slavery crusader, and also an advocate of commercial empires. Livingstone began exploring Africa in the mid-19th century. In 1866, he returned to Africa, this time to Zanzibar, wanting to find the source of the Nile River. This house, again, it looked a lot better back when he lived there, in southern Tanzania, is where Livingstone began his last expedition. He assembled a team of freed slaves, islanders, and 2 servants from his previous expedition. Livingstone was completely out of contact with the outside world for the next 6 years. He didn't think he was lost, but the rest of the world did. Now here's what happened. In 1869, the year began as Livingstone was extremely ill. His assistants had just started to desert him, and they stole whatever medicine and supplies they could get from him. They returned to Zanzibar and told the authorities there that Livingstone had died. But he was saved by Arab slave traders who gave him medicine and carried him to one of their outposts. In any event, he was ill for most of the last 4 years of his life. Livingstone suffered with malaria and cholera and had tropical ulcers on his feet. In any event, David Livingstone was forced to rely on those slave traders. He witnessed the murder of 400 Africans by the slavers, and that massacre horrified Livingstone and left him too shattered to continue in his search for the Nile. In the meantime, Stanley traveled to Zanzibar. He outfitted an expedition to find Livingstone. They had the best of everything. There was about 8.5 tons of equipment and gear, and it required at least 200 people to carry it all. Stanley's expedition, which ran about 700 miles through tropical jungle, soon became a nightmare. He had a thoroughbred stallion that he was going to ride, and it died within a few days after a bite from a tsetse fly and some parasitic worms. Stanley was reported to have found Livingstone in 1871 in Tanzania. He may have greeted him with the now famous, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Many scholars believe this phrase may have been a fabrication. Why the doubt? Well, Stanley tore out of his diary all the pages that related to the encounter with Livingstone. Even Livingstone's diary and the account of the meeting fails to mention those words. One biographer argued that Stanley invented it after the fact because of his own insecurity about his background. And it kind of works. In 1883, the Royal Geographic Society sent an expedition to find a way through tribal lands to Lake Victoria. This was seen as an important route for the British to get into Kenya. Within a decade, the British had established a protectorate over Kenyan territory. Under the so-called treaties of 1904 and 1911, local tribes agreed, quote, of their own free will that their removal to definite and final reserves was for their undoubted good, unquote. In other words, the natives supposedly concluded that it was in their own best interest to give up the best watered and most productive land and move to lands that they knew to be arid, unproductive, and unfavorable to their way of life. Yeah, it works for me. The British took roughly 60% of the land that the natives had once used. The local sense of loss and betrayal never went away. The first glimmer of hope to right that wrong didn't occur until 1962 at a thing called the Lancaster House Conference. That was intended to establish the terms of self-governance for Kenya. The Maasai sent a delegation to London to make their case. However, the request for their lands just fell on deaf ears. But we're not quite finished with Stanley just yet. We need to segue back a little bit to Tipu Tib. You remember him. He was the wealthy slave trader in Zanzibar. In early 1887, Stanley arrived in Zanzibar and proposed that Tipu Tib be made governor of the Stanley Falls district in the Congo Free State. Tibb's autobiography was the first written word that was done in the Swahili language. Later on, Tipu Tib died of malaria at his home in Stone Town on Zanzibar. Now, Henry became Sir Henry Morton Stanley when he was made a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. That was in 1899 in recognition of his service to the British Empire in Africa. I wonder if they ever found out what his real name was before they did that. In the meantime, Great Britain and Germany were plotting to obtain parts of Zanzibar's sultanate for their own empires. Eventually, control of the country fell into the hands of the British Empire. Ships from the Royal Navy were used to enforce a ban on slavery. They captured the dhows, that was the native boats that were carrying slaves. But with only 4 ships patrolling the entire coastline in a huge sea, the Navy found it very hard to enforce the ban. In addition, ships from France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and the United States were still carrying slaves. In 1896, Sultan Khalid took control of Zanzibar. Well, the British didn't really agree, and they didn't want that to happen, and that led to the Anglo-Zanzibar War. When the British attacked, the Sultan and 40 of his followers sought refuge in the German consulate. There they were guarded by armed German soldiers and sailors. The English were stationed outside to arrest them if they tried to leave. But the German consul refused to surrender Khalid to the British. In making his escape, the Sultan stepped directly from the consular grounds onto a German warship and avoided arrest. The Royal Navy bombarded the city. A ceasefire was declared 38 minutes later. Thousands of Arabs and Indians had been killed, and thousands more were expelled or left homeless. To this day, the bombardment of Zanzibar stands as the shortest war in history, all 38 minutes of it. But it was not without consequences. The Royal Navy destroyed the palace. The badly damaged complex saw its harem and lighthouse demolished. And a month after the Zanzibar Revolution, the Sultan's palace, which at the time started to look a little bit better, was formally renamed the People's Palace, and it was converted into use as a government seat after they restored it. Sultan Khalid was ultimately captured by the British forces in 1916 during the East African campaign of World War I. He was exiled to the Seychelles before being allowed to return to East Africa before his death. Tanzania remained a possession of Portugal for almost 2 centuries. They appointed governors who were hated by the natives. The natives, in turn, asked Oman to assist them in driving the foreigners out. The bloody Zanzibar Revolution led to the establishment of the People's Republic of Zanzibar. In turn, it merged with mainland Tanzania and was renamed the United Republic of Tanzania. The country gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1963 as a constitutional monarchy. A proposal to amend Zanzibar's constitution was adopted by 66% of the voters in 2010. That constitution allows rival parties to form governments of national unity. Well, I'll go back a little bit. In 1916, British settlers reached a milestone in Kenya's history when that country became a crown colony. That gave the settlers more power. The Kenya-Africa Union, or KAU, began a political protest movement. The union demanded access to white-owned land. The rebellion against British colonial rule caused Kenya to be in a state of emergency from 1916 until 1959. The British rule officially ended when Kenya finally was gained its independence in 1963. When the incumbent from the colonial era was declared the winner of elections, violence erupted across the country. It was not until about 1,300 people were dead and hundreds of thousands were displaced that the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan finally brokered a peace deal. Under pressure from the international and African communities, the country's leaders came to a power-sharing agreement. A new constitution was approved by 2/3 majority, which changed Kenya to a federal system. That system limits the president's power in favor of 47 newly created local county governments. The coat of arms of Kenya features 2 lions, a symbol of protection, holding spears and a traditional East African shield. The shield and spears symbolize unity and defense of freedom. On the shield is a rooster holding an axe while it looks like he's moving forward, and that portrays authority, the will to work, success, and the break of a new dawn. It is also the symbol of the Kenya African National Union, KANU, party that led the country to independence. Today, Kenya has a population of nearly 38 million people. Nairobi is its capital. Most Kenyans are Christian, with nearly even distribution between Protestants and Roman Catholics. About 1/3 of the people are Muslim. The balanced small number is a combination of Hindu and Buddhist. Kenya's national motto is the Swahili word Harambee. It means let us all pull together, and they pretty much have. Harambee! Now, lest you think that's it for today, we have more. And we saved it until last so that anyone who may be offended can leave now. We'll talk about circumcision and drinking cow's blood. Well, at least it's after lunch. We became interested in the Maasai people after seeing them on National Geographic. We see all these people all over the world on these weird programs, and then we decided we're going to go visit them. Anyway, the Masai Mara National Reserve is their home, has an abundance of wild game. It's set inside the Great Rift Valley, and the park itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It covers about 600 square miles, and the park occupies a section of the Great Serengeti ecosystem. Now, the Maasai are semi-nomadic people who originated up in the lower Nile Valley and arrived in Tanzania in the 17th and 18th centuries. Many other ethnic groups were already established in the region. Today, the Maasai population is a little bit over 840,000 in Kenya, and it is expanding or growing. The Maasai warriors are very known for a competitive jumping dance. The boy who jumps the highest attracts the attention of most of the girls. Members of the group who are watching this jumping will often chant, and as the jumps get higher and higher, their voice goes higher and higher. And that's based on the height of the jump. The coming of age ceremony may involve 10 or more days of singing, dancing, and ritual. Now, they shave the boys' heads. Now, afterwards, the young warriors allow their hair to grow back over time, and then they dress it with animal fat and ochre. And they part it across the top of the head at the ear level, and then they braid or plait their hair. And surprisingly enough, it doesn't smell. Who could think? The Maasai are traditionally polygamous, but polyandry is also practiced. Polyandry is when a woman takes 2 or more husbands at the same time. It's believed to be more common in societies that have scarce environmental resources, as well as to limit human population growth and enhance child survival. Within a Maasai tribe, women may marry not just their husband, but the entire age group of men in that tribe. The men are expected to give up their own bed to a visiting male guest who has about the same age. Now, the woman can decide on her own if she'll join the visiting male, but any child that results from that visit is acknowledged as the husband's child and his descendant. They still practice female circumcision. Now, here's a picture I want you to imagine. Here's Susie standing in the middle of Kenya having a debate, we'll say, discussion with a bunch of Kenyan men about why female circumcision was a dumb idea. Now, the Maasai reasoning was, or is, they want to make sure their wives do not experience pleasure with any other man while they're away with the herd or hunting. To them, it makes sense. The men don't marry when they're young, but stay out in the woods for the most part. They're pretty much out all by themselves. The women marry when they are still quite young. A bride will also have 2 rams slaughtered in honor of the occasion. That's her dowry for the whole deal. A high infant mortality rate among the Maasai people results in the babies themselves not being recognized by the tribe until they reach the age of 3 moons. It's about 3 months. So they want to make sure the child is going to survive, so they wait that long. The woman is expected to build their house. The Maasai houses are framed with timber poles that are interwoven with a lattice of smaller branches. It's then plastered with a mixture of mud, sticks, grass, cow dung, human urine, and ash. Kind of makes you want to move there, doesn't it? The cow dung actually ensures that the roof is waterproof. Now, this is one that we went into. The house is really quite small. This one measured about 10 by 17 feet, and the inside is only about 5 feet high. It's very dark inside, as apart from a few very small round holes in the walls, there are no windows. There are usually two beds. They're kind of in little chambers, one for the man and the other for the woman and the small children. Now this is the kitchen in that house. The Maasai houses, as we said, are quite small in size. Within this space, the family cooks, eats, sleeps, socializes, and they store food, fuel, and other household essentials. They may even keep some of their small livestock in the house with them. The Maasai women over 21 are called mama, and the men over 35 are called Mzi. A man's wealth is measured in terms of cattle and children. Someone who has plenty of one, but not the other, is considered to be poor. Like most Africans, Kenyans hold high respect and reverence for their elders. When a warrior becomes an elder, his long plaited hair is shaved off and kept cropped fairly short. To show proper respect to an elder or anyone of high status, you grasp their right wrist with your left hand when you shake hands. Just before shaking hands, you exchange a very common greeting, Jumbo, and that means, how are you? Now remember, Jumbo from the Lion King movie? Oh yeah. Maasai society is patriarchal. The elder men decide most of the major matters for each tribe or group. And it's not uncommon for the husband's family, his parents, to come and live with the family when they get too old to care for themselves. I guess it's their version of PVE. Maasai religious beliefs tell them that God gave them all the cattle on earth. Now this has led to a belief that stealing cattle from another tribe is just a matter of taking back what's rightfully yours anyway. The Maasai believe that eating meat and drinking milk symbolizes the union of man and God. Many Maasai have also adopted Christianity, and it's not unusual to see them wearing a Christian symbol or a crucifix around their neck at the same time they're practicing some of their animalistic rituals. The Maasai are monotheistic, and they worship a single deity that they call Enkai. Enkai means that which began the earth. In the past, burial was reserved for great chiefs, since a dead body is considered to be harmful for the soil. The dead are left out for scavengers. A corpse that is rejected by scavengers is believed to have had something wrong with it. Now, just as a preventive, I guess you could say, by the family when they take this guy and leave him out in the jungle, they don't want to have any social disgrace of the scavengers not devouring the body. So it's not uncommon for bodies to be covered with the fat and blood